Imagine the clash of steel fading into silence. The battlefield is littered with the bodies of fallen warriors, husbands, fathers, brothers, cut down in the fury of an Ottoman charge. For the men, death was final. But for the women left behind, their torment was only beginning. To many, the fate that awaited them was not survival, but something far worse. In the shadow of conquest, the Ottomans practiced a system that struck fear into every enemy they faced. The systematic taking of wives, daughters, and noble women into captivity. They were not merely prisoners. They were spoils of war, tokens of dominance, living reminders of defeat. Some would be sold into markets, others forced into foreign households, stripped of names and identities, and a select few would be dragged into the very heart of Ottoman power, the harem. Now to most, the word harem conjures exotic images of silken rooms, music, and pleasure. But for the women taken against their will, it was a gilded cage. Behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, the harem was both a theatre of luxury and a prison of psychological terror. Imagine a woman, once the respected wife of a warrior, now reduced to a shadow, waiting, never knowing whether she would be chosen for favor, ignored to rot in obscurity, or punished for defiance. This practice was not unique to the Ottomans. Throughout history, empires have asserted dominance not only on battlefields, but in the private chambers of the conquered. The Romans paraded enslaved queens in triumphal marches. Viking raiders dragged women from burning villages. Medieval warlords used forced marriages as a weapon to crush rival lineages. But what made the Ottoman system particularly terrifying was the way it fused politics, religion, and sexuality into a machinery of control. To the common soldier, a sword through the chest was the end. To his wife, it was the beginning of an ordeal that stripped away her family, her culture, and sometimes even her faith. Forced conversions to Islam, the erasure of names, the command to forget old lives, all were tools to break not just the body, but the spirit. And yet within this darkness lay paradoxes. Some women who entered the Ottoman harem rose to unimaginable power, shaping the empire from behind veils and curtains. Others became nameless footnotes, their suffering lost to time. The line between privilege and torment was razor thin, and the cost of survival was often submission. Tonight, we peel back the silken drapes of history to uncover what really happened to the wives of defeated warriors. Were they victims, survivors, or unwilling pawns in a game of empire? Were their lives destroyed or transformed into something even more dangerous? This is not the history you learned in school. This is the story of power, sex, and domination, where the price of defeat was worse than death. And as we journey deeper, you'll see how these forbidden practices didn't just shape private lives, they altered the very destiny of empires. In every empire, power was never measured solely by armies or gold. True power was often hidden in the most intimate places, in bedrooms, in whispered conversations, and in the bodies of those who could not say no. For the Ottomans, like many civilizations before them, sexuality was not merely pleasure, it was a weapon. The harem was not just a chamber of silk and incense, it was a fortress of control. Inside its walls, hundreds of women lived under the watchful eyes of eunuchs, cut off from the outside world. For the Sultan, the harem was a treasury of beauty, desire, and political leverage. Every woman represented more than flesh. She was a bargaining chip, a prize from conquest, a vessel for heirs. To understand this, we must remember, sexuality in the Ottoman world was deeply tied to dominance. The capture of wives and daughters, of fallen enemies, was not just about physical possession. It was about humiliation. For a warrior to know that his family would be absorbed into the enemy's household, forced to submit, stripped of identity, this was conquest at its most psychological. And, yet paradoxically, the harem also became a place where women could wield influence. A concubine favored by the Sultan could rise above all others, bending politics to her will. Entire factions formed around these women, who learned that intimacy with a ruler was the most dangerous form of power. In the so-called sultanate of women, mothers, mistresses, and wives guided the destiny of the empire itself. But the system was built on fear. Women who defied expectations were punished, sometimes brutally. The invisible line between luxury and torment was crossed daily. One day, a woman could wear jewels and silks, the center of attention. The next, she could be cast aside, forgotten, or worse, silenced permanently. Desire in this world was about control. For the Sultan, to command hundreds of women was to prove divine favor and earthly supremacy. For the conquered, it was the final humiliation. In Ottoman eyes, the act of taking a warrior's wife or daughter was the ultimate proof that resistance was broken. It erased the line between battlefield and bedroom, turning victory into an all-encompassing domination. Outside the palace, this system mirrored society at large. Marriage, concubinage, and slavery blurred into one another. For elites, desire was a tool to secure alliances. For commoners, it was a reminder of vulnerability. Any defeat, any misstep, could place one's family at the mercy of this machinery of power. This was not unique to the Ottomans, of course. From Roman emperors to medieval kings, sexuality was used as a language of dominance. But what makes the Ottoman system especially chilling is how it institutionalized the practice. The harem was not chaos, it was order, an entire structure of law, ritual, and surveillance built on the bodies of women. And yet, as we shall see, sometimes this order was shattered. Sometimes, intimacy sparked rebellion. Sometimes, women who were meant to be silent, shadows found their voices, and shook the empire itself. But before we reach those rebellions, we must enter one of the most scandalous chapters of Ottoman history, where the boundaries of power, sex, and cruelty collided in ways that horrified even their own contemporaries. Power in the Ottoman Empire was not abstract, it was embodied in the figure of the Sultan. And within the palace, the harem was both his sanctuary and his battlefield. Nowhere is this more vividly revealed than in the reign of Murad IV, a ruler remembered both for his iron grip on morality and the whispered excesses that unfolded behind palace walls. Murad ascended the throne in 1623 at just 11 years old. The empire he inherited was in chaos. Rebellions in Anatolia, corruption in the court, and a harem already swollen with intrigue. As he grew, Murad became infamous for his brutal enforcement of morality, banning alcohol, tobacco, and even coffee. Publicly, he presented himself as a puritanical warrior king. Yet privately, his court was anything but holy. Captured noblewomen, wives and daughters of defeated rebels, were paraded into the palace. Some were destined for obscurity, placed among the hundreds of concubines whose faces the Sultan might never even glance at. Others, chosen for their beauty or lineage, were thrust into a game of survival. To be selected as Murad's favorite could mean sudden elevation to unimaginable power. To be rejected could mean exile to the cage, or worse, a silent disappearance. In the night, one tale, whispered by European diplomats, speaks of a noblewoman taken after a rebellion in Anatolia. Once a warrior's wife, she was brought to Murad's court, stripped of her identity, and remade as a concubine. For a brief moment, she caught his attention, her fate dangling between privilege and ruin. But when her defiance flared, when she dared to speak of her lost family, her life was snuffed out as casually as one might snuff a candle. To Murad, she was not a woman. She was a message. Resistance leads to obliteration, even in the private chambers of the palace. This brutality was not unique to Murad. His predecessors and successors also wielded the harem as a political weapon. But in Murad's reign, the contradictions were starkest. A ruler who outlawed vice in the streets, yet indulged in absolute control behind palace walls. His reign crystallized the truth that in the Ottoman world, sexuality was not pleasure, it was domination. The scandal did not end with his death. Murad left behind no sons, Only whispers and rumors of women discarded, pregnancies terminated, and lives erased. The harem that had once been his fortress of control became a haunted echo of the cost of his power. For the wives of defeated warriors, their stories were rarely recorded, but their silence spoke volume. The period known as the Sultanate of Women in the 16th and 17th centuries reveals this truth in its darkest light. During this era, the harem's women, mothers, wives, concubines, became political players, wielding influence that rivaled viziers and generals. And at the heart of this drama was the most infamous of all, Hürrem's Sultan, better known to the West as Roxolana. Hürrem was no ordinary concubine. She began as a captive, likely taken in a raid from the Ukrainian steppes and delivered to the palace as a slave. But her rise was meteoric. She won the heart of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire's most powerful ruler. Against tradition, he broke custom and married her, transforming a foreign slave into the legal wife of the Sultan. With this unprecedented move, Hürrem gained not only legitimacy, but immense political power. And with power came intrigue. She maneuvered relentlessly to secure the throne for her own sons, displacing rivals and orchestrating the downfall of Suleiman's heir apparent, Mustafa. Court whispers accused her of sorcery, seduction, and conspiracy. Whether true or exaggerated, her influence was undeniable. Through her, we see how the fate of wives and concubines was not always passive victimhood. Sometimes it was calculated ambition, weaponizing intimacy to reshape history itself. But for every Hürrem who rose, there were countless others who were pawns. The harem was a battlefield of factions, mothers promoting their sons, concubines vying for the sultan's attention, eunuchs manipulating alliances. A single glance from the sultan could elevate a woman to queenly power. A single mistake could see her strangled with a silken cord, her body thrown into the Bosporus. Religion complicated this further. The ulama, the religious scholars of Islam, decried excess and indulgence. They condemned sultans for allowing foreign women, former Christians, to guide imperial policy. Yet the harem persisted because it served a purpose. It bound conquest, desire and dynasty into one. Conquered women became mothers of future rulers. Their bloodlines mixed into the empire's veins. It was a system built on secrecy, but its influence spilled into the open. Decisions of war and peace, treaties with Europe, appointments of grand viziers, all could be traced back to whispers from the harem. Sexual politics became state politics, and the empire was ruled not just by swords, but by silken veils. But such power was perilous. Betrayal was constant, paranoia unending. For every woman who climbed to power, there was another, plotting her fall. Blood stained not only the battlefields of Anatolia and Europe, but the marble corridors of the palace itself. And yet, the story does not end in the palaces of Istanbul. To understand how these taboos shaped the empire at every level, we must look beyond the sultans and their concubines, into the lives of ordinary people, where marriage, slavery, and survival told a darker story of their own. While the intrigues of the harem fascinated diplomats and chroniclers, the true weight of these practices was felt far beyond the palace gates. For the everyday subjects of the empire, the fate of conquered women was not a distant curiosity. It was a shadow that loomed over families, villages, and entire communities. When the Ottoman army swept into enemy territory, the men fought to the death not only for their homeland, but for their wives and daughters. The fear was visceral. If the warriors fell, their families could be seized, scattered, or absorbed into the machinery of empire. For many, the thought of what awaited their loved ones was a greater torment than the prospect of their own death. This is why entire villages sometimes fled ahead of Ottoman advances, abandoning homes rather than risk capture. For the common soldier's wife, defeat meant slavery. She might be sold in the markets of Istanbul or Cairo, purchased by a wealthy household, or sent into distant provinces. Some were forced into marriages that erased their past identities. Others lived as servants in households where their very presence was a reminder of conquest. For these women, survival was possible, but at the cost of autonomy and memory. Among the elites, the story was more complicated. The wives and daughters of defeated nobles could become valuable trophies. They might be married into Ottoman families to secure loyalty, or placed in the palace as hostages, their bodies politicized as much as their status. These women often lived in a paradox, treated with luxury, but never free, always under suspicion, their lives tethered to the empire's politics. And for ordinary Ottoman women, the harem system shaped daily life in subtler but no less profound ways. Gender roles were rigid, marriages arranged with an emphasis on alliances and honor. Double standards flourished. Men could take concubines or slaves, while women were expected to embody chastity and submission. The sight of foreign women elevated in the palace, captives who rose to power, was both shocking and destabilizing. It blurred the boundaries of class, faith, and identity. Religious leaders wrestled with these contradictions. Officially, Islam placed restrictions on slavery and emphasized justice. Yet in practice, conquest created a constant supply of captives, and the empire's economy and household structure absorbed them without question. The result was a society where everyday life carried silent reminders of war, desire, and domination. And, yet, beneath the fear and oppression, there were whispers of resistance. Some women converted willingly, integrating into Ottoman society to carve out a measure of stability. Others resisted quietly, preserving language, customs, or faith in secret. These small acts of defiance were as much a part of daily life as the silks and jewels of the palace. For the empire's subjects, the harem was not just a distant curiosity of sultans. It was a mirror reflecting the imbalance of their world. The powerless made powerless again, the conqueror's desire dictating the fate of the conquered. It was both a reminder of the empire's strength and a symbol of its darkest contradictions. But every system built on fear eventually meets a breaking point. When scandal, excess, or rebellion pushes too far, even the mightiest institutions begin to crack. And in the Ottoman Empire, one such turning point would change the fate of the harem and the women within it forever. Every empire that builds power on fear eventually faces the same danger: fear turning inward. For the Ottomans, the harem, once a fortress of dominance, became a breeding ground for scandal, paranoia, and rebellion. And at certain moments in history, the system buckled under its own weight. One of the most infamous turning points came during the reign of Mehmed III. In 1595, he inherited the throne, but the path to his power was paved with blood. To secure his rule, Mehmed followed the grim Ottoman custom of fratricide, ordering the strangulation of his 19 brothers, many of them children, to prevent rival claims. The killers? Palace officials and eunuchs, carrying out executions within the harem itself. The wails of mothers echoed through the palace corridors as their sons were taken one by one. This horror revealed the harem not as a sanctuary, but as a stage for political terror. For the women, survival meant protecting their sons at any cost, scheming, betraying, even murdering rivals to keep their lineage alive. The intimacy of motherhood became a battlefield. The harem was no longer just a cage of silks and perfumes. It was soaked in the blood of heirs. But fratricide was only one breaking point. Scandals erupted as sultans grew more withdrawn, leaving the harem to act as a shadow government. Concubines and mothers, lacking official roles but wielding immense influence, became targets of resentment. When famine struck or armies failed at the front, common people whispered that the empire was rotting from within, corrupted by women and the secrets of the harem. Religious scholars joined the chorus of condemnation. They railed against indulgence, against the sultan's dependence on foreign concubines, against the moral decay they believed was spreading from palace to society. Pamphlets, sermons, and rumors painted the harem as a nest of vice, blaming it for everything from political weakness to divine punishment. The backlash was not just words. Riots occasionally spilled into the streets of Istanbul, fueled by soldiers and citizens who despised the influence of women over their rulers. Eunuchs were attacked. Palace gates were threatened. The once untouchable veil of secrecy began to tear. Within the most immediate consequence was dynastic instability. By turning succession into a brutal contest of survival, the harem created a cycle of paranoia. Mothers schemed to protect their sons, sultans strangled brothers, and factions plotted ceaselessly. The throne was never secure. Every death, every betrayal, chipped away at the empire's foundation. What had once been intended as a system of control spiraled into chaos. The cultural impact was just as deep. Within the empire, the harem became both admired and feared. To some, it was proof of Ottoman grandeur. Silks, jewels, and women of every nation under one roof. To others, it was the empire's moral rot, a place where lust and politics mingled to poison rulers' judgment. Religious backlash grew louder. Scholars condemned the sultans for abandoning simplicity, for allowing foreign concubines and indulgence to guide state affairs. The harem, once a pillar of power, became a symbol of corruption. Beyond the empire, its reputation spread like wildfire. European travelers, diplomats, and enemies seized on lurid tales of Ottoman excess. Pamphlets and plays painted the harem as a den of sin, where hundreds of women lived only for the carnal whims of despots. These stories, often exaggerated or entirely fabricated, fueled a propaganda war. To Christian Europe, the harem was proof that the Ottomans were not only militarily dangerous, but morally monstrous. The empire was demonized not just as a political threat, but as a cultural nightmare. Yet ironically, some of these stories contained fragments of truth. Archaeological records, court documents, and traveler accounts confirm the existence of fratricide, the political power of women like Hurrem Sultan, and the very real fear faced by conquered families. Fact and fiction blended into a narrative, too powerful to ignore, a tale that still fascinates today. The long-term legacy was paradoxical. The harem both weakened the empire and gave it new life. Through women's influence, reforms were sometimes introduced, alliances secured, and stability maintained. At other times, the same women became catalysts for bloodshed and division. In this duality lies the haunting truth. The system designed to project Ottoman power ultimately revealed its vulnerabilities. Even after the empire's decline, the shadow of the harem lingered. Modern literature, art, and cinema continue to portray it as a place of mystery and forbidden desire. Yet beneath the exotic images lies the real history. Women who suffered, schemed, and survived in a world where their bodies were weapons and their lives a gamble. And as we draw closer to the end of this story, we must ask, what echoes of these forbidden practices remain today? Because history does not bury its secrets. It disguises them, waiting for us to uncover their relevance in our own modern world. We began with